CL 650 presents your source for leading-edge news and information on today's hottest products and services. This is Experts on Call.
Well, good evening. This is Key Pacific Strata Life on CL 650. I'm Tony Gioventu, the Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association, your host. And tonight in the studio with us, we have Dave Shepard from CanStar Restorations and Albert Atfield, who is the Project Manager from CanStar Restorations. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about the gruesomeness and kind of follow up and finish from the last show that we didn't get finished of really the hard effects that are happening in buildings, especially wood frame buildings, where there are damages from water leaks and fires and smoke damage, and it's not getting repaired properly. And it's becoming a more of a common problem that we're finding, because as insurance deductibles and insurance costs are rising, people are tending to try and avoid using their insurance. But the long-term effect is really kind of devastating. So Albert, you're on the front lines. You get to deal with the worst of what it looks like. We have a flood in 201. It fills up 201. Maybe it's a dishwasher, maybe it's a washing machine. It causes problems in 101. Maybe it's below the insurance deductible. People decide to fix it themselves, and one of the units doesn't deal with it. So what happens with that water eventually?
Well, if the water starts as a clean loss, then we have a time frame in which we want to get onto the project and get it dried out quickly. So first we want to try and get in there ASAP and then put in the drying procedures depending on the quality of the water. If it's clean, so we go straight ahead with drying and some subtle removal to facilitate the dry down, and get the building dried to a standard. Now, if you have one unit owner that we cannot get access to, which I believe is what you're referencing, that poses a complex problem, partly due to the problem is that after 24 hours, we're starting to see the grade of the water change to where we now are going to require further removal, which is probably not in anybody's favor at that point. And also we could have some issues with, if we do not comply, rotting of framing, mold growth, et cetera, et cetera. It can get pretty bad.
So you mentioned grade of water. Tell us quickly what.
Well, water is graded in
to?
3 categories. There's category 1, which is a clean water, category 2, which is gray, and then we have category 3, which is our black water floods, which is obviously sewage, if you want to get right down to that. Now, gray water can facilitate from 2 areas, and it's a questionable call, and sometimes sampling is required whether or not the water can be deemed clean. And what that means is we would take some bacterial samples, and if the samples reach a certain grade, then we would have to reclassify it as either black, gray, or whatever that is. Gray, traditionally, it's a 50-50 chance on whether you need to remove it or not. That can be decided amongst the people that are on site due to what the quality of the water is at the time of the loss, if you will, and how fast you get on the loss is important too.
So it's probably pretty helpful to know what the source was as well. Right?
100%. That's the first thing you should determine is the source,
right.
And that'll clarify your actions immediately.
Routine pipe break is probably going to be clean water.
Whether
hot or cold, it's going to be probably clean water.
Sometimes
washing machine, dishwasher.
Well, depending on the source. If it's the drain for the washing machine or the drain for the dishwasher, we're talking about a different source of water,
about gray water, right?
Right, exactly. So now we want to start looking at sampling to determine on how we move forward on that aspect.
Right. And then obviously black water is usually sewer backup within units.
Usually it can be changed from different areas, such as if it's a roof leak and you have bird feces and whatnot running through your roof drains going into there, or it can be from organics which are coming through your ground,
right.
which could be pesticides, et cetera, et cetera. So there is different areas that you'd have to finite to get that exact.
So you go into a unit, you have a unit that's not restored that you can't access. So we've got 3 units in a building that are flooded. 1 building there's no access to. How do you, I guess look at the long-term effect. If that unit isn't restored, maybe it's vacant, maybe the owner doesn't want to deal with it, maybe they don't realize that there's water in the walls of their unit. If there isn't restoration to the unit, what eventually happens in that circumstance?
Nothing good. You're depending on the severity of the loss is going to determine that. So consider it a mild loss. So let's say it's a 5 foot by 5 foot square area in a ceiling. You're going to have wet insulation in there holding water. It's going to hold that water for a very long extended period of time. If the moisture content stays above 16 points, you're going to facilitate the growth of, we won't get into the details on that, but it can be, different types of mold and toxic molds at that. So it is there. You have to determine these things on how, there's times when you need to really take action. And I think if you have wet materials that are holding water, you need to deal with that expedited, if you will.
Well, and one of the comments you made was about insulation holding water. When we're dealing with multifamily buildings, especially wood frame buildings, townhouses and apartment buildings, insulation holding water, which is then adjacent to wood frame construction, if it's not resolved and it's not remedied, eventually is going to result in rot and decay in the wood frame construction, which can eventually affect the structure of the building, which everybody's going to pay for because one person really was neglectful in having or allowing for their unit to be remediated.
Yeah, and one of the things back to what my concerns are is that I think what happens is people sometimes maybe hesitate, and that's probably the worst case scenario, because what that ends up happening is every day counts. So the sooner you deal with it, the least amount of damage there truly is. The longer you wait to deal with it, you might as well take that to the next extreme, because now you could be dealing with rotten framing coming out, et cetera, where originally it might have only been some wet insulation and some drywall. But if it's ignored, it can now cause issues for everybody in the strata lot for that particular one person ignoring the facts.
And odors, which they're going to get as well. Everybody gets to share the odor.
Yes.
Right. Of the rot, the decay,
right,
buildup of mold, all of the other issues that happen. So we have these little windows. We have 3 days, the critical time period, the first 24 hours. Yep. We have 72 hours. We have 7 days. And then, once you start getting past a time where you can safely remove the water without, having further contamination in the building system, it's just where everybody pays for it. And this happens frequently. It's not an uncommon complaint we see in the strata industry.
Well, one of the other things that happens too, and I'm not the expert in this area, but is the longer you ignore it, the less chance you even have to have it insured.
Right.
Now, because it becomes neglect. So now you've got an issue with trying to even help the strata out for that instance. So now everything goes back to the homeowner. He doesn't have money. We have another issue again. So there's delays that can cause everybody a lot of grief. And so the first thing I always say is you want to act quickly and at least get the structure opened and dried. There may be pending damages that can't be repaired for financial reasons that are not to my knowledge, but that's just the way it is. The key is to get it dried and ready for the repair, and then how those homeowners proceed from there, I think, is up to them.
Quick steps. Somebody's just had their washing machine flood or their toilet overflow. What's the quickest thing they can do?
Well, it depends on how bad the overflow is. If the overflow's happened and you have an extreme amount of water, you might consider removing the toilet to let all the water go out. So that's an extreme situation. And usually in high rises, you can disengage the toilet, and then the water's got clear access to get out of the building.
That's not a thing a homeowner should be doing.
No, it's not. So if I was to say the first thing you should do, shut the water supply off. That's the first thing you want to do. You want to stop feeding it with water. If it's a toilet backup, there's not a lot you can do other than hopefully try and clear it. Call a plumber.
Right.
So.
Right. As well, though, again, these are always panic situations. Everybody's always trying to do everything they can as quickly as possible. But as we mentioned in the last show, it's safety first.
Right.
So you've now got a lot of water on the floor. You immediately have a slipping hazard. You probably have an electrical hazard. You could have any number of hazards, certainly cross-contamination. Your toilet is backed up. You're in there dealing with it, doing all the right things, shutting off the water, making sure everything's done to contain it. But then you walk out down the hall through your place with contamination on the bottoms of your feet, and that's now gone throughout. So you do have to take a moment, take a deep breath, and think about safety first.
Right. But even a small overflow, just your toilet overflowing because it's plugged, will eventually probably cause damage to the neighbors downstairs, causes damage to the ceiling of their units. You know, maybe more than that. If the toilet continues to run, we've had, you know, experience with this. You know, the toilet continues to run. You've walked away from it, weren't aware of it. You just continually have this water running in the building. So, you know, but even small damages can be quite costly in circumstances.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Because in a situation like that, if we let the toilet overflow, but we don't address it, now you're dealing with a guy downstairs who maybe has no knowledge that there's been a loss. There may be wet insulation sitting in there, but no ceiling damage. Hence, we have a growing issue, if you will.
So take this to another type of medium. So we know that the effects of water, I think everybody can pretty much figure out water and gravity are a bad combination in buildings. But the other side of it is smoke. We have a grease fire in a unit. It doesn't do much actual physical damage on the surface, but the smoke permeates throughout the building, throughout the ventilation system, or the unit itself is contaminated. How do you deal with smoke restoration?
Smoke restoration's a little bit more challenging, specifically if you're dealing with grease or protein fires. What you visually see usually is not a lot of damage, as you had mentioned, but what you don't see is actually there, and that's the protein attaches to the walls, and then everything else attaches to the proteins.
Right.
So basically you'll get that layer of grease on the walls. So you have to go through a full clean down. As far as the smoke part, that you have to go through air purification, and that's a timely process. And usually you want to attack that soon as possible in order to control that. If not, you have to go into more extensive remediation, such as ozoning, possibly, depending on the process that's being used, ultraviolet, whatever that process is that's being used at the time.
Right.
So, I mean, those are the things that we would do. We
Right.
have access to, obviously, millions of dollars of equipment. But for the person that has that small, it's just a small fire, there's minimal damage or no damage at all, just a smell. The things that we would do, as Albert says, is wipe down all the obvious surfaces. So even if you're not calling us or anyone else to do it, you need to wipe down those surfaces. You need to remove any charred materials, anything that's residual as far as that goes. And then the next thing really is air exchanges. We obviously use big equipment for that kind of thing, but quite honestly, if you have opening windows or run your bathroom fan for days, you know, no one wants to do that, but it's really quite effective in promoting air exchange. So,
Yeah, we've all burnt a piece of toast, so
Yeah.
we know what that looks like. But having a pan or a pot of oil on the stove that catches fire in a grease fire, or in your oven, the impact of that is substantially different.
yes, oh yeah. Again, as Albert says, the protein issue.
Should they be using any type of disinfectants like bleach or anything like that in water
There's
mixtures?
specific cleaners that you should probably do some research on,
Right.
and know what you're using. There's some household ones that would physically work, but I would do a little research on that, and no, not mentioning any. There's many out there.
So, worst case scenario, what you've seen over the years?
Worst case scenario?
Yeah, worst case scenario.
A
Everybody
flood
likes a
or
horror
fire?
story.
A flood or a fire?
Flood.
Well, I've had the worst case flood I've ever been involved in was a 37-story high-rise where somebody opened up the standpipe on the 37th floor. This proceeded to flood 116 units. So that would be my worst case scenario. Now that was a clean water flood for the most part. It was coming out of a standpipe, so it could be deemed differently. I'm sure David could probably tell several stories from his years too, but that would be my worst case scenario.
Well, and it virtually contaminates the entire building system.
Well, yeah, 100%. Out of 116 units, I think there was maybe only 50 left that didn't get affected.
Right.
And no elevators for as long as 3 months.
Right.
So if you're living on the 36th floor, you can imagine the challenges that are facing some of these folks.
And the varying degrees of remediation. Again, we're talking about here's the ideal thing to do, but you'll have everything from A to Z in there. Some will do nothing with it, as you said. Some will do exactly what should be done. So go back to that building 3 years later, you'll find rusted steel studs. You'll find carpet rotting away. You'll find odors, and nobody knows why, because the wall was never opened. So something is in there, but who knows? doing it right, getting to it promptly is important, and the more units you have, there's less likely that there's going to be a uniform approach to all of it.
Well, and people forget that even though their unit's been flooded and the water's been cleaned up the floor, they need to also look at all of their other personal objects, their furniture, their clothing, their bedding, everything else that they own, their records, their paperwork, their documents, filing cabinets. They need to make sure that nothing else has been damaged. And if it is damaged, deal with restoration, because the water held in those areas will do as much damage as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And we've also seen in buildings, we didn't talk about this because it gets really creepy, but we've seen in buildings where buildings have not been restored properly. There's been an excessive amount of water in the building. And it wasn't long before they had significant insect infestations into their buildings as well. Right.
Yeah,
and so rotting carpets, you can guarantee you're going to get insect infestations and all the problems associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, well, so work on some horror stories for next time we talk to you guys. My name's Tony Juventu. I'm the host of Key Pacific Strata Life on CIL 650. We have Dave Shepard from CanStar Restorations and Albert Atfield, who's the project manager for CanStar Restorations. Thank you both for coming into the studio, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Thank you.
This is Experts on Call on CIL 650.